Right. Let me begin in what I've really got to say today, and here we go. 17 years ago, somebody mentioned earlier, 2006, in Lymington in Hampshire, Evelyn Dunbar's first posthumous exhibition took place, marking the centenary of her birth. It was inaugurated by Dr. Roger Foley. Foley, not Foley, incidentally, Foley, Evelyn's husband. His opening words were, "If you haven't already heard of Evelyn Dunbar, you soon will." Now, Roger Foley, who died in 2008, was my uncle, and it befits me today to elaborate his words by saying, "You've heard of Evelyn Dunbar, but that's not the half of it. There's so much more." Now, very few of us would have heard anything at all about Evelyn if it hadn't been for the curator of that Lymington exhibition, who timed it to appear simultaneously with her biography, Evelyn Dunbar, War and Country, Dr. Jill Clark. I'd like to pay a special tribute to Jill Clark today, because without her, and without her pioneering spirit, I doubt if Dunbar studies would have progressed to the point that sees us gathered here today. And gathered here today under the aegis of the indefatigable Peter Forsyth, aided by Tom Dobson. Peter, the guiding spirit of today's event, who's managed to recruit a formidable team. Peter Vass, with his overview of the delights of Evelyn's juvenilia, largely as contained in your recently acquired sketchbooks. I've been fortunate enough to fully share those delights, because before reaching Oxford Brookes and their restoration, they spent some weeks on our dining room table here at home in France, and this thanks to Paul Liss, nonpareil of art dealers Liss Llewellyn, who made them available to me to assess, and who is the source of so many of the artworks now in the care of Oxford Brookes. Then Claire Brenner, I pronounce it as though it were French, perhaps it is French. Brenner, there you are, Claire Brenner, with her studied and entertaining account of Evelyn's relations with the War Advisory Committee. Claire and I spent an interesting hour once clambering up and down step ladders in the Imperial War Museum art store, enjoying the huge privilege of viewing at close quarters a large quantity of Evelyn's war paintings, while remarking on the dreadful quality of the canvas she was sometimes required to paint on. As Claire remarked, it was practically sacking that she had to deal with. It got sorted out later on, though. Then Jan Cox, a stouty scholar, doughty enough to open the lid on Evelyn's beliefs as a Christian Scientist and find something cogent and compelling within a stunning account and a very moving account of Christian Science, with Evelyn and with the art worlds in which she inhabited quite generally. Now, in all these, I think we've been exceptionally lucky, and the resources that Oxford Brookes and the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History have deployed are reassuring, indeed exciting, in the context of future developments in Dunbar studies. And there's such a lot to explore, assess, evaluate, and interpret. We might start with Evelyn's concern with women and their social and economic status in wartime and post-war Britain. I once made a head count of the relative numbers of female and male figures in her images. Naturally, there was a preponderance in favour of women, given the terms of her wartime employment, but all the same, 460 female figures against 130 male figures has something to say to us. The gentlest of feminists, she was also among the most subtle. There's a telling instance of that pointed, arrow-sharp but hidden subtlety in an obscure 1944 war painting called Women's Auxiliary Air Force Store, in which Evelyn calls attention to the blind chauvinism of the War Office or of their clothing subcontractors in assuming that men's shirt sizes will do for women too. And if you look carefully, the officer overseeing the return of bust-unfriendly shirts has Australia on her shoulder flash. Fired by what notions of Commonwealth unity we cannot know, but she has come all the way from Australia for this. Maybe it's unsurprising that at the war's end, the War Artist Advisory Committee consigned this painting to the relatively obscure Kelvin Grove Gallery in Glasgow. Curiously, from what I can gather, the problem of these shirts did not recur. While it might be difficult to quantify her influence in the overall post-war improvement in the status of women, Evelyn is not to be forgotten. Another fertile field for exploration, akin to the countless ploughed fields in Evelyn's pastoral work, is the use of symbol, or layers of symbols, to suggest or imply something else, and to what extent she shares this technique with her contemporaries as something to study. There's very often something hidden in her work, something that leads to what she really wants to tell us. Throughout Evelyn's career, we find deeper meanings below the surface, through the curtain of irony, in the mirror of the allegory, through the open sesame of the allusion. In this connection, I might take unashamed advantage of speaking to you here. In 1950 or 51, Evelyn painted an allegorical image which she entitled Oxford. It featured a long-limbed woman in a red skirt sitting beside the River Thames, holding a maquette of the dreaming spires of Oxford in her lap, sheltered under a mantle of Oxford blue, with the Hinksey and Cumnor Hills in the background. We have the oil sketch. I'm afraid I don't have a reproduction of it, but we have the oil sketch, but the final canvas is lost. I don't believe it ever left Oxford. If anybody knows where it might be, I would really like to know where it is. This canvas was a tribute to Oxford and to the Oxford she loved. She hadn't known it until 1946, when Roger Foley, recently demobbed from the RAF, found a job in the University Agricultural Research Department. Evelyn found work first in the Oxford School of Art. The titles have changed since. And little later at the Ruskin, where she found many of her pre-war friends. Her creative inner fires burned here as rarely before. And it's that I leave you Oxford Brookes, and you Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History, that spark that Peter Vass mentioned, that holy fire, that sacred flame of her work and memory, everything that she stood for, and I know that that flame will be well tended and kept burning brightly. Thank you to all who have contributed today.